studio with your local lay Dominicans. We'll be discussing some of the gems we discovered in our studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message. Representing our St. Albert the Great lay Dominican chapter and co-host of today's show are myself, Cheryl Drozda,
Jeff Drozda,
Michael Totaro.
And today, Michael joined us especially to help us to understand more about the general idea of Thomism and Thomistic thought, because in our studium, we're currently going through St. Thomas's famous work, the Summa, and just trying to understand some of the questions and how he answers, and actually the methodology of how he deals with the questions that he had at his time, and the I guess assimilation of all the material of that time. So, Mike, tell us a little bit more about some of the reasons that you wanted to share this too.
Sure, yeah, of course. So as you indicated that within our own chapter we are studying Saint Thomas's Summa Theologiae, and what I think most Catholics are familiar with St. Thomas Aquinas as being a great saint. Of course, he was a Dominican friar, and he lived in the 13th century. And also, it may be somewhat surprising to some Roman Catholics that a great deal of what we believe as Roman Catholics really comes from the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, again, most notably his Summa Theologiae. And so I have that sort of motivating factor from our own chapter. And also I've taken courses as part of a master's program, online program with Holy Apostles College and Seminary in theology, and pretty much every course I've completed thus far, which has been 6 courses, so 18 hours, graduate hours, and every single one of them have integrated St. Thomas Aquinas. And so let me make one comment that certainly does not make me a Thomistic expert by any means. That'll take the rest of my life, I'm sure, to even begin to move in that direction, in the trajectory that I would like. But nonetheless, it is of particular interest to me because there are so many dimensions and perspectives of St. Thomas Aquinas in his writings that it's so obvious that it is divinely inspired, but yet it's totally rational and reasonable.
And that's the thing. He's just so much more prolific and far-reaching than people realize. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see some of the ways he is incorporated into different modern thinkings and philosophies.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, who was his teacher again?
St. Albert the Great.
Oh, well, there we go. There we go. Our chapter patron saint. So,
yes.
So obviously we invoke St. Albert the Great and St. Thomas and St. Dominic and all the Dominican saints every day.
Absolutely. I would like to, if it's okay, just to give just a quick little snippet of the background behind Thomism. So again, St. Thomas Aquinas was a prominent medieval Christian thinker and an amazing Dominican saint. What makes Thomism particularly interesting and unique is that it is rooted in a synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy. And it is particularly influenced by the works of, obviously, Aristotle, as interpreted by Islamic and Jewish scholars such as Avicenna and Maimonides. We're very fortunate in the West to have had these such Islamic scholars as the ones Jewish scholars as I've just mentioned, such that they kept sort of Aristotle alive, as it were, because his works had kind of been sort of neglected and forgotten about, at least by the West. As we may remember from perhaps prior segments, St. Augustine's theology and his philosophy was primarily based upon Plato. So Aristotle, who was Plato's probably greatest student. And so we're blessed that we have Aristotle still very prominent in the line of thinking that we have in the West. And it was St. Thomas Aquinas who took that and wanted to kind of meld that or merge that with our Roman Catholic Christian faith. And of course, I think we would all agree that he was very effective in doing that.
Was that controversial at the times? I mean, it seemed that, taking those sort of writings from a different culture, a different era, that it could be viewed somewhat controversial.
Yes, absolutely. There was certainly skepticism and concern, which, thanks be to God that, the church, as guided by the Holy Spirit, some say that the church moves a little too slowly, but my response is the church moves at a rate and a speed that is in accordance with the will of God, and so it is good to have these sorts of kinds of concerns and critiques and even criticisms. But at the end of the day, by way of the Holy Spirit, the church brings it to its sort of correct interpretation.
I do think St. Albert the Great it's notable to say that he stood up for his student at that time. St. Thomas passed away before St. Albert, and I think some of his writings were under criticism, and several people, but especially St. Albert, came to the rescue, stood up for it, and obviously that truth prevailed.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned that because, as we've mentioned many times before in other segments, as for the Dominican order, right? Veritas, truth, is really what we are, dedicated to a better understanding of truth. And even St. Thomas Aquinas himself essentially defines truth as an alignment of the mind with reality. And that is an interesting contrast to what modern philosophy attempts to say, which is there can be many truths, which seems to be that could be a whole other segment, but that's sort of a contradiction. And St. Thomas, even though his works are pretty complex, fundamentally he says we just have to put our hands on the real things, the creation, and just try and understand them. It's nothing more than that. It's not a figment of my imagination or anything of that sort.
So I've heard Thomism discussed, but can you help us to kind of grasp what that actually means?
Sure. Well, so in answer to the question, we can look at Thomism as containing several key elements. Okay. So the first is natural theology. So here, Thomas Aquinas argued for the compatibility of faith and reason. And we know that today there is this sort of, at least there are some perceptions that there's contradiction between faith and reason. But we can feel comforted in knowing that our faith is reasonable. This natural theology, according as explained by St. Thomas Aquinas, basically asserted that reason could lead to the understanding of God's existence and attributes through observation of the natural world. And of course, St. Thomas himself cites, as he always does, right, Holy Scripture considerably to demonstrate that.
So that also makes me think of St. Albert once again, just as maybe because I've been trying to get more information about our patron, but he was very big on observing things and wanted to observe them, which was something that really wasn't as, a used methodology. He sort of brought this idea that we do sort of an experiments and we do observation, and then we can actually know that these are the results, these are the conclusions that we can draw. And so it's interesting that as you see some of the things that happened with St. Thomas that he pronounced, that his teacher is one that would demonstrate a lot of these things as well.
Yes, absolutely. And this sort of takes us to going back to Aristotle. One of his works is known as metaphysics, and so it turns out that a second key element of Thomism is metaphysics, which basically delves into such concepts as substance, form, and essence. His approach to metaphysics is quite often seen as a response to earlier philosophical traditions, but most particularly that of Plato and Aristotle. A third key element of Thomism is ethics. So St. Thomas Aquinas developed a natural law ethical theory, stating that ethical principles could be discerned through reason, and that these principles were inherent in the natural order. So once again, notice that there are two sort of, I guess, mechanisms here, right? We've got this mechanism of reason, human reason, and of course the natural order. Okay, and then finally, a fourth key element of Thomism is epistemology. Of course, epistemology is a study of knowledge. So his epistemology emphasizes the importance of both faith and reason in acquiring knowledge. It acknowledges the limitations of human understanding, but also affirms the possibility of knowledge through divine revelation and natural reason.
So obviously knowledge is different than wisdom, and want to make sure to clarify that because I'm doing Father Mike Schmidt's Bible in the year, so I'm a little bit behind here, but talking about Proverbs and wisdom, and there's definitely a difference. And St. Thomas knew that. And what I find interesting in the third point that you mentioned with regard to ethics and natural law, I mean, we look at what the church teaches on marriage, on the sanctity of life. It all goes back to natural law. And so for those of you who think maybe St. Thomas is kind of too old and his thoughts are too old, it's definitely ingrained and incorporated in the church's teachings even today.
Timeless, huh?
That's right.
Absolutely. Definitely timeless, yes. And that's one thing that I'm glad you mentioned that, Jeff, because it's a reminder to us that, so despite the fact that St. Thomas, was a medieval thinker and great saint of the church, his ideas were done not exclusively just for as a means by which he can become, make himself very famous or well known, but prayerfully, because if you study his life, he was absolutely a very deeply prayerful person. He spent a lot of time in prayer. It's honestly, I am amazed that I believe he died I think he was about age 49 when he died. So that's a young man from my perspective, and yet he had time to compose and write all these amazing works, the Summa Theologia of which is only one, but his most prolific work, and yet he spent a lot of time in prayer. So it is timeless, as you said, Cheryl.
So tell us a little bit about, we've heard about these schools of Thomistic thought. Tell us more about it, because how do you fall into one of these schools, and what does that entail?
That's a great question, and I think that there is sometimes this maybe confusion or perhaps misunderstanding about what different schools of thought really mean. Now, I'm not going to attempt to get into the nature of schools of thought in general terms, but certainly when we're talking about schools of Thomism and Thomistic thought, okay, we're not talking merely about, well, you've got this group that thinks, that Thomism is this, and there's another group that thinks it's that, and the two are diametrically opposed. Really, what we're saying is that each school of Thomistic thought, or Thomism, attempts to interpret and adapt St. Thomas's thought in different ways. So as I see it, we're looking at different perspectives of the same thing. There is Thomism, the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas, and then there are different schools of Thomism which attempt to, from different angles, different dimensions, different perspectives, attempt to interpret properly and with always, searching for staying within the framework of truth. So I think I want to make that clear, because we're not talking about like debates that exist among these various groups that one is trying to, kind of up one over the other, but rather they're just, thank God he has given us the ability to reason and to question and to explore, so that we can better understand that. In that way, we can better understand whatever it is we seek to understand. So there are some notable Thomistic schools, the first of which is termed as classical Thomism. In classical Thomism, this particular school of Thomism actually adheres closely to Aquinas' original writings, pretty much placing a high value on a literal interpretation of his works, and emphasizing the compatibility of Thomism with modern thought. A second is Neo-Thomism, which basically emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Neo-Thomism sought to apply Thomistic principles to contemporary and modern issues and engage with modern philosophy. Turns out that Neo-Thomism played a significant role in the revival of Thomistic thought, and we'll speak to something about that shortly. A third school is called existential Thomism, and so this refers to some thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre, who was himself an existentialist philosopher, attempting to blend Thomistic ideas with existentialist philosophy and exploring themes of freedom, individuality, and responsibility. And then there's analytical Thomism, which, if you have any sort of kind of maybe prior studies of philosophy, there is an analytical philosophy sort of area. Anyway, this school, analytical Thomism, seeks to express Thomistic ideas in a contemporary analytical framework, which engages oftentimes with issues in terms of philosophy of mind, metaphysics, and language. And so I think fundamentally what this illustrates, these schools illustrate the adaptability and the enduring influence of Thomism as scholars continue to engage with and develop St. Thomas's ideas in response to evolving intellectual and cultural contexts.
You're listening to 90.5 FM and 99.5 FM, 1230 AM. We are Catholic Radio for Acadiana, and you are listening to Studium to Studio, brought to you by Stein Lumber. We greatly appreciate the support of Stein Lumber with locations throughout Acadiana. We are your Third Order Dominicans, based out of Our Lady of Wisdom Church here in Lafayette, Louisiana. And so today we are talking about not just St. Thomas, but Thomism, what it is, and what we can learn from it. And thankfully, we have Michael here to explain it all to us. So please continue to educate us a little bit more on what this all means.
Okay. Well, I'm trying. Well, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that.
I'm taking copious notes.
Well, so at this point, I think it would be helpful for us to kind of step back for a moment and look at, the significance of Thomism, especially from the standpoint of our church. So in August of 1879, Pope Leo XIII promulgated an encyclical, papal encyclical, entitled Aeterni Patris. And this papal encyclical, which, by the way, is available online. You can go to Vatican.va, or you can access it by way of EWTN and various other sort of sites. But this papal encyclical focused on Thomistic philosophy, and it's often considered, as an encyclical, a landmark document in the revival of Thomism in the Roman Catholic Church during the late 19th century. And so Pope Leo XIII, in his encyclical Aeterni Patris, emphasized the importance of the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas as a guide for theological and philosophical studies within the Catholic Church. And so just as a side note, so for anyone who, might have been told or might even be tempted to think that, well, the church is not really deeply, philosophical, theological. Well, happily, that's not quite correct. Again, our faith is reasonable, and therefore it would make sense that it is definitely rock solid theologically and philosophical. In any event, the encyclical encouraged the study of Aquinas' works by all the faithful, and recommended that his philosophy be the foundation of seminary education. So going back to my own sort of personal experience, not that I'm not in seminary, but again, the master's program of which I'm a student, a graduate student, Holy Apostles College and Seminary, is a seminary. And so I suppose that, my experiences thus far, having completed 18 credit hours of 6 courses, kind of sort of demonstrates that this is the case, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, every course I've had thus far includes St. Thomas Aquinas, and most of the time it's Summa Theologiae.
Well, I'm just glad you brought up Pope Leo XIII, because every time I turn around, I see, something about Pope Leo XIII. And you had mentioned that he became Pope in 1878 and then reigned until his death in 1903. I mean, there's a lot going on. If you heard the show from last week, the Boxer Rebellion was taking place during that time.
Yes.
And so for those of you who didn't hear last week's show, I encourage you to go ahead to the podcast and download that and learn a little bit more about St. Mark G. But that's once again for another show that you can download. But Pope Leo had such an impact on Catholic social teaching. I mean, he was the one that actually brought this forward and something for consideration. He also had an encyclical on how the government should not supersede the church. And I think he wrote 13 encyclicals on the rosary. And so, I mean, he's just such a powerful and influential pope. So encourage all the listeners to learn more and more about Pope Leo the 13th, because I think he's been like knocking on my door for the last couple months. So.
Sounds like it.
So can you give some examples of maybe some modern writers and so forth that kind of embrace these Thomistic thoughts?
Sure, of course. Yeah. So if we look at the 20th century, I mean, we're in the 21st century, but, again, we've already spoken to the resurgence of Thomism, late 19th and early 20th centuries. So, for example, in the case of Neo-Thomism, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, we have such prominent figures as Jacques Maritain and Etienne Gilson, each of whom were prolific in their writings in philosophy, and of course there's much theology embedded within their philosophy. And interestingly, and that would probably require a whole other segment, but even though Jacques Maritain and Etienne Gilson are part of this sort of Neo-Thomism school, they did have some sort of differing opinions at a different level. So once again, they were not like loggerheads at all, but they just had different sort of. They were attempting to explain some aspects of St. Thomas's works, but from different points of view. And so that's just a side note there. There's also, staying with Jacques Maritain, he also was a leading figure who, in the 20th century, advocated for a, quote, an integral humanism, end quote, that applied Thomistic principles to various aspects of human life, which would include politics, ethics, and education. He emphasized the importance of natural law and the dignity of the human person. So some of his works, some of his published works, philosophical works, are, basically social and political philosophy, for example. Then we turn to existential Thomism, which, I've already mentioned Jean-Paul Sartre. There was also Gabriel Marcel, and these individuals explored the intersection of Thomistic thought with existentialism. And so they sought to reconcile existential concerns with Thomistic metaphysics, thus trying to address issues of human existence, freedom, and personal responsibility. I can continue a little bit if you like.
Yeah.
I also mentioned analytical Thomism, and so philosophers such as Elizabeth Anscombe and Anthony Kinney engage with Thomistic themes within the analytical philosophy tradition, contributing to what is known as analytical Thomism. So again, integrating Thomistic philosophy with analytical methods as already developed within analytical philosophy. And of course, to reiterate something that we've already addressed, and that is, the 20th century saw a renewed interest in the study of Aquinas' original texts and a reevaluation of his thought. So scholars have delved most recently into Aquinas' metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, thereby contributing to a deeper understanding of Thomistic philosophy. Staying with currency and contemporary sort of ideas, Vatican II. So the Second Vatican Council had a significant impact on Catholic theology, and Thomistic ideas actually played a role in shaping some of its documents. The Council emphasized the importance of dialogue with the modern world, while also upholding certain Thomistic principles, but especially in the areas of natural law and ethics.
Well, I find that very interesting because, of course, there are so many good documents that came from Vatican II. I would encourage all of you to actually read the key documents that came from Vatican II, because if you read the actual documents, they're just a wealth of knowledge, and I know some individuals kind of taking different liberties one way or the other, but the documents themselves really put a roadwork, a groundwork for where the church is to go for the next century and beyond. And it's just always reassuring that Thomistic thought was included in Vatican II.
Absolutely.
Do you have any final thoughts, Mike, that you want people to kind of walk away with for our topic of Thomism?
Sure. So I think since we're about to kind of wrap it all up, so if we take everything that we've discussed over these past few minutes, I think it's important for us to put things into perspective and proper context. So, there have been, and something that you alluded to very early on in our segment, Jeff, and so there have been critiques, right? Not only just during the time of St. Thomas Aquinas, okay, but even currently, contemporary, critiques and challenges. And so despite the revival of Thomism, the 20th century did, also we also saw critiques of Aquinas' philosophy. Some philosophers actually challenged various aspects of Thomistic metaphysics, and there have been debates within the Thomistic community about how to engage with modern philosophical developments. But on the whole, 20th century Thomism was marked by a dynamic interaction with contemporary philosophical trends, efforts to apply Thomistic principles to modern challenges, and a reinvigorated interest in the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas.
So if someone wanted to become a Thomist, is there like a club? Do you have to sign up for it? Is there a certificate you get? What constitutes declaring oneself a Thomist?
Right. So great question. So there is
101?
Thomist 101.
Is that Peter Kraft one?
No. This is the friars in the St. Joseph province, northeast, and I think it's Thomistic 101. But you can just do a Google search on St. Thomas 101, and that'll take you to their site. They have some excellent free courses that also. The videos are fantastic. The friars are just amazing, which, by the way, happens to include our very own Father Aquinas Gilbo as one of the friars who has made videos for this project. The site also has recommendations and links and references that it's an education in all of itself.
They do, I think it's Aquinas in a minute or something like that, and they have various different friars presenting on just basic Thomistic thought, and so that's at least one area that folks can look at.
So I do that, and I can be a Thomist, right?
I guess so.
I
guess so.
I like that.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, and remember to stand firm in the absolute truth, Jesus Christ, because only the truth bears grace. God bless.
Lived through time, passed through fire, broke my heart, wounded desire, changed my life, fixed